Hello and welcome to Coffee Lovers TV. On the show today, I'm going to be showing you all about how to brew a great V60. Now, the V60 is a surprisingly complex brewing method, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but basically there are some key variables with this brewer that give you absolute control over how it brews. Because of that, I consider it a more advanced brewing method, because if you don't understand how to manipulate those variables, small changes can completely change how your coffee brews, and that can lead to consistency challenges. Now what I'm going to do today is go over a little bit about the uniqueness of the V60, tell you what you're going to need, and then I'm going to show you how I brew. I did a number of experiments just fiddling around with the brew method, not looking at what anyone else is doing. I came up with my own process that has been very useful for consistently, very consistently brewing a good cup of coffee. And then from there, I can tell you what you can play around with to perhaps find your own brewing method. You can, of course, use what I do. There are many other people who have examples of V60 brewing methods. They all produce a good cup of coffee in different ways. So we're gonna have fun going through that. Okay, before we get into what you need, so the V60, the Hario V60, designed and made by Hario, came out in 2004. And it's named after the degree angle that the cone makes. So this is a completely round cone, and that aspect of it contributes to encouraging equal water movement towards the center. So that's part of the V60's goal in producing a smooth, even extraction. Because one of the challenges in pour-over brewing is water traveling evenly through all the grounds. Because when I brew through this, obviously you're going to see you'll have a mass of grounds here, and then you pour the water in, and then what happens? If the water all goes through one side, then some grounds are not going to be as extracted as others, and then even extraction means less consistency, less delicious coffee, less control, all that sort of thing. So the size and shape of the filter of the V60, that 60-degree angle and its roundness, contribute to more even extraction. Next, the hole in the bottom is quite large for a brewer. When I set this up, you'll see the filter is going to stick through the bottom. The reason for the large hole is actually very important. It removes the filter holder as a restrictor of flow. So as a counterexample, if you watch my Kalita Wave brewing video, the Kalita Wave has 3 small holes at the bottom that intentionally restrict the flow of the coffee coming out. So the water can only flow so fast through the Kalita Wave. The only restriction on the flow of water and coffee through this brewer is the grind size and how you pour the water. And that's where the incredible versatility and variability of the V60 comes in. You have complete control over the brew, and you can make a wide range of different sort of flavors from a particular coffee just by controlling those 2 variables. And it's because of that things get really tricky. Okay, we're gonna get into that a little bit more later. And lastly, you see the ribbed sides here. That keeps the filter off the edges and gives the coffee a little more room to expand, aiding in extraction. Because as the grounds take water, they expand, and we want the grounds to do that so that they can have as much of the coffee solids extracted as possible. So all of these things lead to really well-balanced cup. In fact, I think that I'd say the V60, when done correctly, probably produces the most balanced cup of coffee, but it requires, I think, more attention and care in the brewing than many other methods. That's not necessarily a bad thing, just kind of depends on what you enjoy. I don't always brew on the V60 because of that. Oftentimes I'm lazy. I'm a huge fan of the Kalita Wave for other reasons, but I still really like coffee that comes from the V60. It's incredibly balanced when you do it right. And the method that I show you today, I think produces a very consistent, very balanced cup of coffee. One of the nice benefits of the V60 is I have the porcelain one here. You can get them in many materials. The plastic ones are super cheap, and a lot of people actually prefer them. So before I get into that, let's get into what you're gonna need, because I'm gonna get into the actual brewing here really soon. So what you need, of course, the V60. Like I said, you can get it in plastic, you can get it in porcelain, you can get it in metal, you can get it in copper. It doesn't matter what you decide, which one you decide to get, but some of the other steps that we get to are going to change depending on which one you choose. I'll get into that in a moment. Okay. So you need the V60. Now you can just put this right on your cup. I awkwardly have chosen a glass mug today. I always feel very wary of putting a porcelain V60 on glass. But so you could do this. You could brew right into a glass cup. Just keep in mind how much you're brewing and how much is going to go in there. I like to always brew into a carafe because then I can pour smaller amounts. I can brew more and pour smaller amounts. I mean, those are kind of the main benefits. I like brewing in a carafe. It looks good. You know, I can handle the coffee easy, etc. Here I have a Kalita carafe because that's the one I have. Hario makes one. You can use any kind of container, whatever. Brew into a jar if you want to. Point is, you need the V60 and something to brew into. Could be your mug. What I'm going to be doing today is brewing 25 grams of coffee to 400 grams of water. So that's a bit too much for most mugs. In that case, you would want a carafe. Okay, and then of course, you're gonna need filters. So very important note on these. There are two different sets of filters floating around. And it's a little vague as to exactly what's going on. I think the newest manufacturing of Hario filters are different. I think these are the older ones. The newer ones, which you'll see people calling tabbed, it's a little hard to see. If you're looking on like Amazon, for example, looking to order on Amazon, it's hard to see. But the tabbed ones actually have like a physical tab on the filter. These have no tab. And the difference between the two filters is in their texture. Ultimately, for what I'm going to show you today, it doesn't matter. If you use the different filters that I'm using, some of the variables might change, like the grind size might need to be slightly different because the water flow could be different coming through the filter. Don't worry about any of that. What I'm going to do is show you the process I use, which can be adjusted easily without changing the consistency, and that's going to give you, I think, the best understanding and tools for brewing your own V60, changing variables, and exploring the whole process, because that's what I think is really fun about this. So anyways, you're gonna need filters. The standard V60 uses these number 2 Hario filters. And then you will want a scale. I use the Akaya, always use the Akaya, I love it. Any old scale will do just fine. I mean, I use a scale for all brewing no matter what, even French press, which is pretty straightforward. But the V60, due to its variability, I think it's foolish to try to eyeball doing a V60. You're not going to get consistency that way. So you definitely want to be brewing on a scale. When I get to the brewing, you'll see all that. Lastly, very, very important, you need a slow pouring kettle. Now I have the Fellow kettle here, which I love, has great pour control, and it looks fantastic. And it comes with a thermometer, which is kind of nice. But any gooseneck kettle will do just fine. You cannot brew a good consistent V60 without a kettle that lets you pour slowly and precisely. And for that, you're going to need some kind of gooseneck style kettle. I'll link below a number of options so you can check them out. But if you have just a standard tea kettle, that's not going to do. And you'll see why when we get to the actual brewing. But one of the major variables that determines the result that you get out of the coffee is the water flow and how you pour the water into the V60. So if you don't have control over that, you're just not going to be able to brew a good consistent V60. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to get to the brewing here in a second. I'll touch on the materials really quickly since we're sitting here, because I'm going to change the video view for the actual brewing. So, like I said, I've got a porcelain brewer here. I really like it. Feels good, looks good, works great. The thing that you have to keep in mind, and the reason why I mentioned that a lot of people prefer the plastic one, is the heat. Because one of the variables that you control or you have to keep in mind when you're brewing is the heat in the brewer. When we get to setting up, one of the steps is going to be rinsing the filter, and part of that process is heating up this brewer, because if I put this in cold, even if I rinse, I don't heat it up enough, or if I don't rinse, and I just brew straight cold into this brewer, it's gonna suck heat out of the coffee slush, whatever you want to call it, that's brewing in here. Having that temperature change happen during the brew, it's really hard to track exactly what results from that, but it's going to give you inconsistency in your brew. You want to keep the heat high and as stable as possible. So what you're going to see during the brew method is I'll have a number of different pours, and I'm not like super precise on those, but one thing, and the reason for having either a number of different pours or one long super slow pour, which I don't like doing because I'm lazy, is to keep the temperature stable. Right before the brew, it's going to be important to not only rinse the filter, but heat up the vessel. And the porcelain one requires a bit more heat because it's going to absorb the heat. Now, the nice thing about it is once you heat it up, it actually helps sustain the heat in the brew, I think, better than other brewers. The reason why I said I've heard people exclaim that they prefer the plastic brewer is that it doesn't suck out a lot of heat. But my theory is that this kind of brewer, if you preheat it properly, will sustain your brew heat much better. Anyways, those are just hypotheses. The copper brewer could possibly work the same way. I actually haven't used it. In any case, the process is going to be the same. I just wanted to make a note about materials. If you want to get started cheaply, go ahead and get the plastic one. There are a number of other really nice options, of course, but you can jump in and be brewing on a V60 for, if you have to get all this equipment, if you have to get the V60, the kettle, the filters, the scale, you could start brewing for, maybe $40. That includes everything. You can probably go a little cheaper getting it all on Amazon, but that's a pretty good price for brewing a really good cup of coffee. We will have to keep in mind the grind, and I'm going to get into that in the brewing method, but that's totally separate. Okay, I'm rambling on enough here. Let's get into the brewing. I'm going to change it up, and we're going to go through all of the steps. Okay, so like I said, set up here with the scale. We've got the V60 on a carafe. First step, we'll be adding our filter, and just as a point of interest, this is what you do with the crease. I like to kind of push it to the sides just to get the filter as even as possible, and then kind of hold it in place at the bottom. And now we need to rinse, and the rinse is very important. So we're doing two things here. The first thing that we're doing is actually rinsing the filter to get as much paper taste out as possible. And secondly, and the reason I'm using so much water, is we want to heat up the actual brewer so that when we brew, it doesn't suck any of the heat out of the brew. Be sure to empty the carafe. Don't brew into your rinse water. All right, the next step is adding the grounds. Now, as far as the grind size itself goes, I say go for like table salt. This is like medium fine-ish grind. On the Brazza Encore, I grind between 12 and 14. This one is actually at 13 right now. I go down to 11 sometimes. Just to play around with it, I like to push it as fine as possible. But as a general guideline, you're looking at sort of table salt fineness. And we have added, I forgot to zero out my scale, but this is 25 grams of coffee. We're doing 25 grams ground coffee to 400 grams of water. And that's a 16-to-1 ratio. So I generally brew with a 16-to-1 ratio with the V60. Okay, so we've rinsed, heated up the V60 in the process, added our ground coffee. Now it's time to pour. And the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna bloom. And I generally bloom with about 2-to-1 I usually just eyeball it, and I pour pretty slow during the bloom. I'm just trying to cover everything. Actually, that's going to be less than 2 to 1. We're at 41 grams. There's 25 grams of coffee in there, so I think that'll be enough. And I'm just going to let that sit for a moment. In the meantime, I'm going to heat my water back up again. I like to do this between my pours on the V60 just to keep the water temperature of the water going in as high as possible, because when you pour and when it gets into here, the temperature of the water is going to drop. And it's really hard to measure that. So you're not going to hurt your coffee brewing with boiling water. Don't worry about that. As soon as you take the kettle off, it's going to settle pretty quickly, and then you're good to go. High heat in brewing is really something that is mostly important in espresso, and that's not what we're doing. Okay, so the bloom is done. Now it's time to brew. And what I do here, just start off pretty straightforward, and I do these concentric circles throughout all of my brewing just to evenly distribute the water. And I'm gonna go up to 100, 120 grams here, just on the initial. And then what I'm gonna do is a little spin. And what this is gonna do is help make sure that all the grounds are saturated and the water is going to flow through them evenly. It also gets some of the stuff off the sides. Don't worry about these fines. They're not terribly important right now. But you'll notice there's no more air bubbles coming up. Before I continue talking, see the water level starting to drop below there? I'm going to start pouring again. For this one, I'm going to go up to about probably where you see the line. That should take me to about 200. Yeah, 220, that's fine. We're going up to 400, remember. Okay, so you're seeing very little bubbles come up. That means that there's no air trapped in the grounds, there's no gases trapped in there. All the grounds were equally saturated and the water is evenly flowing through them. So we're not really worrying about channeling now. And that's one of the main reasons for the spin. And actually, I'm seeing maybe some grounds come up here. I sometimes throw another spin in between, sometimes after that second pour. So maybe I'll do just another one really quick. And now, through the rest of the pour, when it gets down to about that point, I'm just going to keep pouring, pour a little bit more. So, reason for the spin, get the grounds evenly soaked and the water evenly flowing through them. And it settles the ground bed, which makes just everything extract a bit more evenly. We're pouring slow to disturb that as little as possible. And I'm pouring kind of in these phases just to, I don't want the water going too high. You know, that's kind of about the height that I like it at with this amount of coffee in here. If I'm lazy, sometimes I'll do a bit more. This part isn't too terribly dramatic. Part of the reason for doing multiple pours, or you could choose to pour very slowly and consistently, is keeping that temperature higher. We're at about 350 grams right now, so I'm going to let this draw down a little bit before adding the last 50. Actually, I'm going to stick my water back on the heat really quick. So, like I said, the important thing here is even extraction. No bubbles coming up means no air trapped. The water should be flowing evenly through all the grounds. We're getting a really good extraction here. And I'm just going to let it draw down a little bit more before I add the last 50. All right. And like I said, each time you see I do these kind of concentric circles, pour slow, going up to 400 here in just a second. And there we go. So now that I've done that, I'm going to do one last spin. Just always do this. This is the reason to not go too high. But what I'm doing is knocking any grounds off the sides and settling the bed to do one last even extraction through the whole thing. And I'm just going to let this brew down and then talk a little bit more after it's done. Okay, so now the water is getting through the last bit of grounds here. I noticed a couple of things on this brew. So actually it's brewed a little bit slower than it has been brewing on me, and that could be because this is a new coffee to me. I actually broke out a new coffee just for this video. It's an Ethiopian coffee. It could be a little bit of a denser coffee, so that could be contributing to some stuff. You'll see around the edges there's like kind of this muddiness, and those are fines. Could be my grind size is maybe a little too fine, because I think that maybe took a little too long. What you can do, and what a lot of people do with the V60, is actually time the whole thing. I'm not a big fan of doing that. I just like to follow these simple processes, because what I just did is it, and we're done brewing here. And honestly, it doesn't really need to be more complex than that. Just gonna try to give you a view of the ground bed. It actually looks pretty decent. It's a little muddy. I don't know if the camera's picking that up. The muddiness is a result of really fine grinds in there, as they call them, fines. And the fineness of that could be contributing to why it was taking a little bit longer to brew. But that is the end result. What I'm gonna do now is switch back over the camera, and we're gonna try this out. Because before I make any conclusions about that brew that I just did, I was being slightly critical at the end, but before I make any conclusions, I wanna taste this, because this could still taste fantastic. So switch over the camera, and I'll be right back. So that is brewing on the V60 in a nutshell. Now I made a note of a couple of things in the end there. So first off, it did seem to be brewing a little bit slower than I'm used to. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's one of the reasons I don't actually like using timers. I mean, a timer can be a good way of measuring consistent process, but sometimes a brew will take a lot longer and I'll still really, really like the result. So I'm not going to decry the use of timers, because they obviously have their place in helping with consistency. I just think it's one of those things that is not necessary for learning how to make a consistent brew. It's something that you can use to enhance, I think, in the long term if you really want to get into it. But using the process that I just demonstrated for the V60, I think is going to be something that gives you a really good consistent brew. And one of the main reasons for that is that spin, especially at the beginning, gets all those grounds evenly extracting right away. And that's what you really want. If you'll see, and when I first started out and I wasn't doing that, I was noticing a lot of bubbles coming up during the beginning of the brew process and right after the bloom even. And I experimented with stirring, actually, as I do in the Chemex. But in this process, that ended up resulting in an over-extraction. It's possible you could incorporate using a stir with the bloom and get the result that you want. You'll just have to fiddle with the other variables, how you pour the water, the grind size, that sort of thing. But when I started using the spin instead, I just really liked the result, and the result was consistent. So that's what I use. Before I make any conclusions about about which I was critical, that is, the grind size here could be too fine, and that's due to my analysis of the muddiness and the time it took. Let's actually try the coffee. This is an Ethiopian coffee. And I have had it before. It's just been a little while. I cupped this coffee, so I'm somewhat familiar. Very clean, smooth but rich. So I think that's actually a really good cup of coffee. I can see it approaching maybe a little bit over extraction. So I would, if I had a lot of this coffee, I'd probably experiment going one tick coarser in the grind just to see what would happen. But I'm still pretty happy with this result. Good sweetness, bit of peach in there. Peach and almost a little bit of mint. Really interesting. An Ethiopian coffee. Okay, so now that you have that process to use, the things that you can change, of course, you don't have to do the spinning like I do. You do want to, the bloom period is really important. Getting the ground saturated, getting as much of those gases out of there as possible is going to aid in the extraction. The biggest disruptor, I think, to extraction and brewing with the V60 is channeling, the potential for channeling which can happen when there's too much gas stuck in there, and just any kind of uneven extraction due to the flow of water through the coffee bed in general. And to me, the combination of using the spin and the even pouring takes care of that. So some things you can do, you can use less pours. Often, and you'll see in my written directions, I say I use like 3 to 4. I think I used a bit more in that one, probably because I was talking and pouring at the same time. But I usually go up a little bit higher on the first pour and let it go down, and then I do 2 or 3 more during the whole process. It also kind of depends on how much coffee I'm brewing with. Due to the space, if I'm going down to 20 grams, then I'm going to use less pours just because of the amount of space that's available. So the way you decide to pour the water and the grind size that you use will determine everything. You can have a pretty good variability on grind size in what you use with the V60, and the result that you get from that, I think I'm going to leave up to you to determine. I think the coarser that you go, the less rich of a cup of coffee you're going to make. I always like pushing the fineness of my grinds in all of my brews, because the more surface area you have on your coffee, the more you're going to extract from it. And that is always what I'm interested in doing. So from that point of view, I think that this brewer makes a really good tool for pushing the fineness of your grind. I think you can go a lot finer than you think with this brewer. It's just going to depend on your grinder. Like I said, I use the Bratza Encore. And while the Encore is one of the best low-end priced home grinders, it does still produce a not insignificant range in the grind size. So you do get fines with the Encore. If you're using a much higher priced grinder, I think you'll be able to go much finer, just because you're not going to get as much muddiness. And the muddiness in here, I think, probably contributes a lot more to the flow of the coffee than you might think, because you can clog the filter. One thing I could play around with is using a sifter, but I think that's a little bit extreme. Although I might do that as an example just to see how fine I can go brewing on the V60. All right, so that has been brewing on the V60. That's my method. Produces a delicious cup of coffee. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them below in the comments. I'm happy to do more exploration with this brew process. I think that there's plenty more that can be toyed around with. That should probably go in another video, because this video is going to be long enough as it is. But if you have any questions, please leave them below in the comments. Always happy to talk coffee. I'm going to link to everything that I've used on the show today below, so you can get what you need to make a really good V60. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.